you'd be surprised how many brands really don't know what a tolerable ROAS is for them. You hear very often, brands talk about ROAS, return on ad spend. So for every dollar I put into marketing, how many dollars of revenue can I drive? Interestingly, what I find in so many companies is that they're quick to say, we need a 3 ROAS, we need a 4 ROAS. And then when you ask them, what is a tolerable ROAS for the P&L within your business? They go, they scratch their head and they say, well, we don't really know. Somebody once told us that 3 or 4 ROAS was good. Well, some businesses, a 3 ROAS might not be good. Maybe you have low cost, a low gross margin because your cost of goods are high. Maybe you're a business that your margin is low because in order for you to generate sales, you have to be highly promotional. So, a 3 ROAS is not the same for every business.
Well, first of all, Mark, pleasure to have you here. Great to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, Zan. Thanks for having me.
I always like to start these just with a little bit of background and context. I understand you've been in the world of marketing for a while now. So where does this journey start for you? If we can kind of bring it back to the beginning.
It actually started in finance. I was an auditor for one of what doesn't exist anymore, the Big 8 accounting firms, and did that for a few years. One of my first clients was a company that was the original founder of J.Crew, and ultimately met some folks that started the J.Crew business, went to work for them in a startup catalog business. I didn't know anything about direct marketing, learned it there. And then somewhere around 2000, had my first opportunity to make a pivot into digital. I went to work as the chief marketing officer at Brooks Brothers. They had just created their nascent web business, and the rest. This time now, for the last 25 years or so, has been very heavily focused on digital marketing, physical retail, and then what goes around comes around. Direct mail, is to some degree back in style a bit. So that's how I got started.
Yeah, back in the direct mail days. Well, and then as that journey goes forward, so you spent a large portion of this 25 years as an operator in large direct-to-consumer businesses, building up from the ground up, really that digital presence, as I understand it. And then today, where does that bring to you in your journey today?
So for the last 6 years or so, and at various times in between jobs over the last 25 years, I've consulted. And it was interesting when I first was restructured out of a job in 2010, what was I going to do? I wasn't sure anybody was ever going to pay me for what I knew to be a consultant, but I started a business, and for that year before I wound up going to run the e-commerce business at Steve Madden, I consulted, and it was a combination of helping brands drive traffic to their sites, how to optimize that traffic. And then, for the last 6 years after I left Madden, I've been doing almost exclusively that. I've had a couple of runs, shorter term, full-time roles, but essentially it's the same, story. It's, how do you handle customers that want to shop online? In some cases, it's been with businesses that have had physical stores. So how do you leverage a physical store fleet for your online business? And how do you drive traffic into stores through digital marketing?
And I want to get into some of the nitty gritty here in a bit, but let's just start at like the high level. Like when you're seeing these companies, you clearly have many touch points with many different companies. And today is a different time than it was, when you first started. So I'm wondering if there's pattern recognition on the companies you're speaking today, these big things that you see, hey, a lot of companies, they're spending, I don't know, tens of millions of dollars on media spend in the consumer space. What are the things that they should focus on and think about?
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting, there's so much similarity between the large companies and the small companies. There's certainly nuances of things. When you're small, you don't have enough staff, you don't have enough capital, perhaps to help grow your business. You need some critical mass to gain leverage on the spend that you have. But at the end of the day, you still have to drive that traffic to the site, and you got to get people to want to buy your product. And whether you're 10 million, 2 million, 200 million, you still have the same challenges. They're just at a different degree. So there's a lot of, that similarity between companies, whether they're big or small. I like to get it into a company because of my original background in finance and accounting. I like to look at the P&L of a business because that really tells you almost everything that you need to know. And oftentimes when I get a new role or I'm pitching a new role with a client, I ask them, hey, can we sit down and talk about your P&L? Let's go from top line sales all the way down to as low as they'll take me. Sometimes they don't want to show you EBITDA or operating income, but even if they take you down to contribution margin, you can learn a lot very quickly from the business through looking at their P&L.
Do you think that that's really kind of a framework that a lot of these companies aren't doing on the day to day?
No, I think most companies are, pretty religious about looking at the P&L and understanding, what it's doing. To be fair, there's plenty that don't do it in the way that I might think that they should. Finance, accounting, are one of those back office operations that small businesses can't really afford to staff. And even today in larger companies, they've whittled down their accounting, teams and analyst teams because they want to put more dollars into either marketing or technology or something that's revenue generating, not kind of a historian, if you will. But I'm a believer that if you understand the P&L, it will help you identify areas that you should be improving on. And I'm guessing we're going to talk about some of those, but there's a lot of room for improvement for sure.
Yeah, one of the things that we've seen before talking to companies is that there's really this like step function in how much you want to invest into the analytics and the understanding of your data compared to that variable spend. Because, if it's a smaller company, maybe you're okay with it being a little bit less precise. But as you hit other tranches, it's like a leaky bucket. Sooner or later, you start realizing that there's millions of dollars that could be optimized in a better way.
Yeah, and for sure. And when you start to look at the P&L and you start with top down, obviously the revenue that you're driving, and the key identifiers are what is your cost of goods, and therefore your gross margin dollars that you have available to cover all of your fixed and your variable expenses, and then marketing. Marketing is the other than your cost of goods and perhaps your labor, your marketing, may be the most significant line on your P&L. And a lot of businesses look at it very differently. Some businesses are focused on first order profitability if they're an online business. Some are willing to lose money depending upon their capital and their product that they're selling. They're willing to lose money to grow, and hopefully they generate enough rebuy from those customers to help ultimately drive profitability.
Right. And so what are some of those metrics that you think of as, the golden standard? And I know it's pretty unique to the different companies, but just I'm asking this as a way for us to kind of walk through some different frameworks for some specific companies.
Yeah, look, there are a lot. You hear very often, brands talk about ROAS, return on ad spend. So for every dollar I put into marketing, how many dollars of revenue can I drive? Interestingly, what I find in so many companies is that they're quick to say, we need a 3 ROAS, we need a 4 ROAS. And then when you ask them, what is a tolerable ROAS for the P&L within your business, they go, they scratch their head and they say, well, we don't really know. Somebody once told us that 3 or 4 ROAS was good. Well, some businesses, a 3 ROAS might not be good. Maybe you have low cost, a low gross margin because your cost of goods are high. Maybe you're a business that your margin is low because in order for you to generate sales, you have to be highly promotional. So, a 3 ROAS is not the same for every business. And you'd be surprised how many brands really don't know what a tolerable ROAS is for them. So that's kind of number one. Number two is CAC. Customer cost of customer acquisition costs. How many dollars does it cost me to drive a new customer into my business? If it costs me $20 to drive a new customer, well, I better have some confidence that I'm going to drive more than $20 of profit from that company over a near-term window, either on that first order or maybe on, within the next 12 months. But I need to know what it costs me to acquire customers. And then, the LTV, or the near-term value, the long-term value, that is a function of the rebuy rate. How frequently will somebody buy? And then, what they spend on each of those purchases. So, I'm a performance marketer. I could spend the next hour with you, talking about metrics, but, those are some of the more important ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that I've found interesting when we've had the opportunity to talk to companies is that when you find the right telemetry to focus on the number, let's use lifetime value as an example, then you can identify customer cohorts to go after where you're going to be spending more money to capture that group. But then when you capture them, if you look at it at the right time horizon, you're going to be much more profitable. And so it's those little somewhat of illusions that are in the data that you need to be able to pull out, which I think have been able to drive is the greatest amount of growth and enterprise value in terms of the companies that we've worked with. And I'm wondering if there's been little stories that you've had that resonate in a similar way.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is right. You can't always get, if you're analytically capable of identifying those cohorts of customers that you reference that are the ones that are the greatest lifetime value. For example, maybe you've got an apparel business, and for whatever reason, people that come on to your file for the first time that buy dresses, maybe they give you the greatest lifetime value, right? Maybe it's because the price point's higher. Maybe it's because that's what your brand is known for. I don't know what causes it, but you know that the category of first purchase is really important. Well, if that is the case and you can feel comfortable that the data is accurate, well, then maybe you need to lean into having a wider assortment of dresses. Maybe you need to put more marketing dollars behind dresses. That's one piece. The other piece is really the source of the traffic that is driving the greatest LTV customers. Now that brings up a challenge. There's on my podcast, we talk about the A word, and I don't talk about it very much because it's complicated, and that's attribution. And, we can sit here and talk about, should it be last click? Should it be first click? Should it be some kind of a multi-touch attribution? But however you do it and however you analyze, you should be able to come away with the source of the traffic that you have and which source is bringing you the greatest lifetime value customers.
There's a David Minella who I work with as a co-host of the All Dots podcast. He likes to say that all attribution systems are wrong. The question is how wrong, and how can we think about what we can pull and learn from each attribution system to be able to find the most directional truth, given whatever investment is in the fixed cost for us to scale.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, I did a show recently and we got into this attribution, conversation. And, I think the guest said something similar, and why do we do last click? Because it's easy to do. Most of the systems that are out there, the tools that you use, offer a last click attribution. And, we all seem to gravitate to something that's simple and maybe close enough. But, it really depends upon your business. If you're a business that is spending a lot of dollars top of funnel for brand awareness, and you use last click, you're not going to be doing that brand awareness campaign for very long, because those dollars are not going to demonstrate any kind of a return on your ad spend. So, if that's the case, you need to be thinking about some kind of a multi-touch attribution where you give credit for the various stops along the way that a customer takes before they actually make their purchase.
Let's talk about attribution for these companies that are like 100 million to 250 million. I mean, even bigger than that too. But a lot of these companies have grown to a certain point. And so if you're on the outside and you're hearing about this, you're like, you haven't figured out attribution. I mean, the answer, of course, is they have figured out attribution to a point. But the question is how do they think about it at this stage? So when they come to you and they say, Mark, hey, can you come in here? This is our mess. Like, what does that story usually look like in terms of, hey, that's the problem set that we have right now?
Yeah, it's interesting because, and I don't know what the break point is. Excuse me. Every, company is a bit different. I know plenty of companies that are in that, size range that you talked about that are using last click as their source of truth and their analytic of the business. There are more and more trying to do, MMT, models. They're trying to work with media mix, kinds of situations, which, makes total sense. But those solutions are not inexpensive. And, a lot of these companies don't have anybody to manage the third party that they feel like they need to actually do the work. They don't have data scientists internally. They may not even have enough analysts that are smart enough to be able to go manage in an agency. And look, I'm a big agency user in my career, but you've got to have somebody internally, whether it's a digital agency or any kind of third-party analytics solution. Somebody has to own that relationship and push the agency because, after a while, agencies, some get lazy. And if the client is not pushing them, then, you're not going to get what you're paying for. So, anyway, back to answer your question, MMT is not for everybody because it's expensive and it's complicated.
Yeah, what you touched on there with agencies, I think is something that like every founder feels, right? Which is that you hire some agencies, the lifespan of most agencies is not the same as the lifespan of the business you're running. But then of course, there's the reasons why you hire an agency instead of doing it in-house, because you can usually move faster and you're trying to bring expertise, and there's some compelling points there. But when it comes to this problem of thinking about, okay, the BI system and how do we really look at the data the right way and then manage that? I mean, what are some of the specifics that you've found when it comes to the problem of, okay, build in-house versus don't build in-house? And how would you recommend to maybe a founder or whoever you're talking to, maybe it's a CMO, to say, this is how you can think about the two different options you have on the table?
Yeah, I mean, look, some of it is about cost of ownership, for sure. With an agency, it's not a fixed cost. It's essentially, I mean, it may be fixed in what you're paying, but, you can change your mind, tomorrow. And, you can go to a new agency, or the agency, maybe you have somebody on your account that you don't particularly like. If the agency is large enough, they can slot somebody in and, you essentially don't lose a beat. If you're a smaller shop and, maybe you're early stage, and you want to do it internally, you're likely only going to be able to hire one person, and that one person is going to have the keys to the kingdom. And if they get hit by a bus, God forbid, or you decide you don't like them, or they hit the lottery, now you don't have any bench strength and cross training likely in your team. So I like the agency side for the earlier stage companies. There's a lot of folks who say, you know what, I want to do it internally. I will move faster. I will be able to iterate. I will be able to test, and I don't have to pay 8 to 10 to 12 to 15% on top of my media, for the agency. So that's a part of it. And I think the other piece, when you start to get larger, and maybe you can afford a few people, what I still like is the fact that the internal organization is somewhat insular. Where is the learning? Where do they get the learning about the new and greatest things that Facebook and Google are coming up with? If you're not large enough to get a seat at the table with somebody with a clue at Meta or at Google, you kind of left to your own devices if you're not with an agency. But if you choose an agency that happens to be, one of the platinum or gold or whatever they're giving away these days, partners, at least you have somebody that can maybe get an audience with people that understand some of these third parties.
It's interesting because it's really talking about how many of the people out there are really true experts at this, and how do you think about resourcing for that for your own internal company? I think I hope, we'll see. I think some of my private equity friends are probably listening to this right now. And, those growth private equity guys, when they talk to me, one of the questions they always have is like, when you're thinking about digital transformation and how to take a company and say, hey, you know what, great company in every way, but there's probably a huge amount of change and investment that we can do in terms of this digital transformation, and then we can turn it around and say sell it. Like that's the way they're thinking. But then the question, of course, is, well, how big is that problem in the market today? Is this a niche thing that maybe some companies are out there? Is this something that you're seeing with a ton of companies right now, saying that there's an opportunity for that part to be fixed and for them to scale?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's really interesting about some of these businesses is that you can you can try to grow, but you may not be successful in growing. And I've seen a lot of businesses that are able to grow because they're buying the new customers. But they buy these new customers, they get a lot of growth, and then they're not turning these new customers into rebuyers. They're really trial buyers. I like to talk about as a first-time buyer is really a trial buyer. It's not until they make the second or third purchase that I really want to start talking to them about being, as customers. It's not just about customer excuse me, it's not just about customer acquisition. It's also about, rebuy. Oftentimes you have businesses where their catalog of product is oftentimes either so narrow or of a product type that the customer is not in the market for that product on a regular basis. Either it's not a consumable. I'll give you a perfect example. Beauty brands tend to have their core product. Maybe they have some new product introductions, but they don't introduce new product quite the way fashion businesses. And I spent my entire career in fashion for the most part. Every month, every few weeks, new products. And new products bring energy into the business. It gives you something new to talk about. And customers like new. Maybe not so much in beauty. I've been counseled that once the woman finds the color she likes, the odor she likes, the fragrance that she likes, or the foundation that she likes, new and improved for her is scary. She doesn't want new and improved. But, on the apparel side, she wants newness. Even guys, they want newness as well.
So it really comes down to some of the fundamentals of the consumer behavior tied to what the business model is. And that makes a big difference in terms of like, how much can we think about the opportunity behind being able to scale this digitally versus whatever the status quo that's been able to get you to the point they are today.
Yeah. And, you didn't ask about loyalty, but maybe I just, put a comment about it, because, so many brands, they have the list of boxes they feel like they want to check, and loyalty has become one of those things. Oh, I got to have a loyalty program. When I was at Steve Madden, we launched a loyalty program, and honestly, I wasn't certain that we really needed a loyalty program based upon frequency of purchase and some other things. But in our case, we were really looking for the first party data that the customer was going to provide, right? So we created a mobile app, just like you could get in so many places now, so that a customer would walk into one of our stores and he or she would buy a product. The store associate would scan their app, their points would go right to them, and now we were able to tie together an online customer and a store customer and see their 360 view. And in every business that I've ever been in, a multi-channel customer is the best customer. So whether it was the old days of catalog when we had customers using a 800 phone number and or mailing in an order, the multi-channel, if they interacted with us in multiple ways, they were your best customer. Fast forward all these years, if they are an online and a store customer, they're absolutely your best customers.
So they're the best customers if they're going to be buying through these digital channels. Tell me more about what that looks like. Like, why is that on the ground level?
Well, just the fact that, they've engaged with you in multiple ways. Think about, your favorite retailer, whomever they are. I'll give a call out to one of mine. So there's a brand called Faraday. All right. Alex Faraday and his twin brother have started a men's and women's apparel business. Alex was a guest on the show. I live in Westfield, New Jersey. He opened a store in Westfield. They've got a beautiful product line. And in their business, they've got customers like me who shop online and shop in store. And the fact that they now have all of my data in a unified database, in a CDP, whatever you want to call it, they can see how frequently I'm buying in transactions. They can see that maybe I'm buying in store, buying online, returning in store. Maybe I'm going into a store, they don't have it, they're shipping to me at home. All of that information and all of those touch points, the more that you've got, generally speaking, the people that have those greater amount of touch points are better customers.
I wanted to ask you about kind of how technology is changing and shaping this. I mean, the core question here is that I think a lot of marketers understand that there's going to be components of AI that are going to be essential for this next stage of growth. And AI is this really broad word that means a bunch of things to different people. We have, of course, generative AI in the creative, and then we have what we're talking about on the BI side, which really I would consider more the mathematical models. Can you help me dissect, from your opinion, what parts of this are like, hey, marketers should be focusing on that, and what parts of this are relatively noise at this moment?
Well, I'm no AI expert by any stretch of the imagination. As a matter of fact, I play around with ChatGPT just like everybody else. I was telling a fellow this afternoon that I was networking with. I was just sitting around, and I wanted to see what kind of images ChatGPT could generate for me. And I happened to have an image of my daughter's dog, Lucy. And today's Lucy's birthday. I just found out on Instagram, right? She's 6 years old. And I put in that Lucy was a baseball fan and she was a New York Mets fan. Well, 2 minutes later, I got an image of Lucy wearing a baseball uniform with a Mets logo and a Mets cap. And it serves no purpose other than I was interested to see what could happen. But the point of the story is that it's really early, and I don't know what people will be able to do. But if I could do something silly like that, we already are hearing about, brands, using CGI and computer generated graphics and other kinds of AI tools to do a photo shoot. And not having to pay for models, not having to pay for photographers, doing it all from a computer. I think we're going to see more and more of that as things get more expensive in other areas. We kidded at the top of the show, about tariffs. Everybody is looking now. If you're going to be selling product where you'll be impacted, people are looking for ways to either generate more revenue to offset those costs or to cut costs to offset the tariff. And I think AI will be one of those areas. From a analytics perspective, the ability to consume so much more data and so much more information about the customers, their interaction with us online, their intent to do things, to be able to analyze that data quickly and much more quickly give the customer something that they don't even know that they want, but that we're able to assimilate because of all of the data. That should be able to help us.
I think that something that you've talked about a bunch, which definitely resonates with me, is how do we focus on the P&L and think about everything that we're doing as an investment, right? And really bring that up to the bottom line.
I talk a lot about shiny object syndrome because it's so easy to fall prey, to the next big thing. But it may not be shiny object. Just to finish on the AI topic, there's so much conversation going on now about the ability, what ability we will have for customers to shop through ChatGPT or other AI agents. We've come from a Google where we typed in shirt or blue shirt or Faraday shirt to a much longer number of terms. I want a blue Faraday shirt with plaid and long sleeves, and you're going to be able to elaborate even further on that in a Chat GPT, and then see products come up I read something today where there's this rumor that ChatGPT and Shopify are going to be, and not to push rumors, but that's what I read, and where they're going to come together. And if you do that, customers can start their shopping perhaps not on Meta and in Google, but on a chat agent.
I mean, it makes sense. I know that myself and most of the people I know are thinking about any of their buying decisions and starting that with AI today. So the question is, how quickly are companies going to catch up and say, "Hey, this is where behavior is going for consumers, and so we gotta be there."
Yeah, because I've been doing this, for a while, I sometimes get caught in these conversations with folks about, the buzzwords of the moment, and throughout my career, there were all kinds of buzzwords. And, it was only a few years ago, maybe it's 7, 8, 9 years ago, where, nobody was thinking that a customer would consume a message on their mobile device through SMS. And it took a lot of brands a very long time to think that their customer, especially the luxury brands, the luxury brands, my luxury friends are going to get mad at me for saying this. The luxury brands always seem to be a little late to anything that's a little technological or a little different, because they have this mentality: my customer won't like it, or we don't do that here. And I know I'm generalizing, but now most brands use SMS the same way we use email. And I'm sure if we're sitting here 2 or 3 or 5 years from now, everybody is going to have a AI store from which they're selling.
Yeah, I mean, I think that resonates with me, the idea that luxury brands tend to be a step behind. My hypothesis may be that it has to do with the fact that they have much better margins, and so they can relax back into brand, whereas the e-commerce brands that maybe have a lower AOV have to be really tight in terms of how they're thinking about their marketing dollars because of the nature of their business. So
Yeah, and I can, I understand. I do a lot of work, either when I was in the brand or now helping other brands with post-purchase kinds of programs, post-purchase advertising. And, it's not for everybody. I get it. But, if you are looking for ways to, we're always looking for ways to monetize, things that we've got. In the old days, it was, how do I monetize the catalogs that I send out? How do I monetize the packages that go out? How do I monetize the phone calls, that I'm getting into a call center? And now it's the same way. How do I monetize emails or my site experience or the orders I get online? And there are a lot of tools to help you do that. But some brands are just not ready. They don't want to, they believe that it will take away from the brand experience, the customer's experience with that brand, and they avoid them.
Throughout this conversation, we've talked about kind of both the marketing side and then also the financial side, and sometimes that's 2 feet in 2 different worlds. Like you have the CMO and the CFO, and so when companies bring you on, at what level do you tend to talk to that executive team, and how do you manage the different expectations of those 2 seats?
Yeah, I'm lucky, honestly, because I have a financial background, so that gives me some almost immediate credibility, because I always lead with that. I make sure that they understand that I'm not just a marketing guy. I'm not the creative guy. I'm a performance marketer, but I understand the numbers. I understand the P&L, and just about everything up and down the P&L. So that's really helpful. And then, usually, if you're dealing with brand marketers as the chief marketing officer, it's a little bit more challenging, because the brand marketers, they're about the brand and not so much about the numbers. And it depends upon the company. And then there's plenty of people that are the brand marketers that, do understand the numbers. But, you get them all in the room, and oftentimes they're not aligned about what the goals are. And that's, it's sometimes a little uncomfortable to be the third wheel in that conversation. But I feel like, what the cliche, what you measure, you will do well with. And you've got to agree on both sides. What are those things that we want to measure? And then agree on how to measure them, and then make sure you have the tools in place to do so.
Got it. So it's really about this common language that you're focusing on, and then it's through the metrics, the KPIs, and then how do you when you mention tools, can you say more about that? Like in the best practices, we're talking about A+ companies that have figured out. What is your experience and what that looks like?
Well, it's back to what we talked about before. Excuse me. It's back to, the attribution, conversation we had before, getting buy-in that, both the finance people and the marketing people have the same view of performance. The worst thing that could happen is, you've got the finance guys with a set of tools that are looking at last click, and then the marketing guys who are making all their decisions based on platform data, and never the twain shall meet. And I see businesses like that, all the time. So it's really about, commonality of the information. And, it doesn't have to be complicated tools either. It just has to be, look, you could make GA4 work for you. There's tons of tools that are out there that can work for you. You just need to make sure that they're set up right, that the data is close. And I say that because if you're on a Shopify platform today, you're never going to get it to tie to your GA4 data. Or if you're on, you could be on an Adobe tool, and it may not even match your Salesforce e-commerce platform, but you'll get them close enough. And I think you just need that commonality of analysis.
Right. That kind of one source of truth to be able to see everything across.
One throat to choke in the agency, and one source of truth in the data side.
Exactly. I wanted to talk to you about your podcast as well. So you've talked to all kinds of founders and executives of growth stage companies and all, even companies outside of that. What are some things that come up in a lot of your conversations? What are some common themes where you're like having that conversation over and over again?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I've done 120 some odd shows over the last 5 years. So it's been a good opportunity to learn, and I learn something new from each of the shows that I do, which is kind of why I keep doing it. I think there's a few things that are common. Number one is nobody ever has enough resources to do all that they want to do, and that goes from the Levi's of the world down to the earliest stage startup. Nobody's ever got enough resources. That's number one. Number two, most everybody sucks at prioritization. They tend, and I mentioned the shiny object syndrome. A lot of companies really struggle setting a roadmap and then living with that roadmap and having strict enough requirements for things that should displace something on the roadmap. I think we see that a lot in big and small companies. I think the other thing, that you see, we talked about it a few times already, is attribution. If they are marketers in retail in any way, they all struggle a bit with that area. I think they also, seem to struggle in data analytics and, the assembly of data, and maybe more importantly, having the data structured in a way that allows them to really use the data in an intelligent way. Because it's one thing to have data in a data vault, which a lot of companies have, but how do I use that data to help it generate revenue for me? So you see that too. I talk to a lot of startups and early stage companies. And if they're selling, regardless of what they're selling, it could be a service, it could be a product. They lament the long sales cycle that they often have, which is, I've been there. I've been the buyer and I've been a seller of my service. And, you see some people jump right in and some people, are just not ready, and you have to bring them along. So big or small, there are a lot of commonalities.
That's interesting to talk to, because, in a world where, we're talking about this world of direct to consumer primarily, where everything is like these numbers of trying to get people in the funnel. But of course, there's a whole category of businesses where you have a sales team connected to a marketing team. And then that expands all the way up until you have more and more sales. And eventually you get to a place where you're really B2B and then account-based marketing. And so those transitions of different types of companies and how they interact with the customers have demand different focuses. I'm wondering if, your experience with dealing with direct-to-consumer businesses has had some things that brought you information and education in terms of how to handle a B2B business.
That's interesting. I haven't had very much experience in B2B, but you know, I've bought a lot of services over time, and one of the things that's always struck me is that, and I've been asked this a lot, or I've been told this a lot, and look, I'm no smarter than the next guy, right? That's for sure. But for so many times, I've been told, "Geez, nobody ever asked us that before." And I think that, there's just a lot of brands, a lot of companies that buy services, buy a tool, and they really don't know what they're buying. They haven't had time to kick the tires hard enough. Either they don't fully understand it, and you'd be surprised, and I'm generalizing for sure, because there's a ton of great salespeople in B2B, environments that, understand what they're selling, but they don't sometimes know enough about the company they're selling to, or, what it is that makes me make a decision of whether I'm going to buy your solution or not. They know their solution, but they don't know me. They don't know my economics. They don't know my decision process. And I'll date myself. There used to be a company called Sims Clothing, a guy named Cy Sims. And Cy Sims' tagline was, "An educated consumer is our best customer." And I've always believed that if I'm going to be a good sales guy, I've got to understand, my customer, and I've got to educate them as much as they're asking me, because then they'll be able to make a more informed decision.
Last question for you. You've done this podcast. You said, what was it?
122, I think.
122. And these podcasts, I mean, I listen to some of them. They're not short podcasts. They're not all of them. And so you've had a lot of conversations. Do you have a favorite question, or do you have a question that you find yourself coming back to over and over again?
Absolutely. It's the first question that I open every single show since February of 2020, when we started this. It's basically asking the guest what their first story is. I didn't come up with that. I stole it from somebody. And basically the idea behind that is, tell the audience, where you grew up, how you grew up, and whether there was anything in your upbringing that might have suggested you'd be a X, you'd be an entrepreneur, you'd be a marketing vice president, you'd be, whatever it is they turned out to be. And it's interesting. It focuses on something beyond marketing and work. Most people are introspective about their upbringing, and I will say the most consistent thing that's so interesting. So many people that are entrepreneurs today that I've had on the show, and if I had to guess, I'd say that 25% of the folks are, or maybe a third, are entrepreneurial in some way. So many of them, a parent or their parents had their own business as well. And it could have been a grocery store. They could have been a shoemaker. They could have been, just a mom and pop candy store. But they had their own business, and they controlled their day-to-day business themselves. And these folks that are the entrepreneurs that I talk to, they reference that time and time again.
I love that. And I'm curious, I mean, has somebody had the opportunity to ask you the question yourself? But if there was anything in your childhood that led you to what you've done today?
No, nobody's asked me that. That's great that you did. No, nothing in my childhood, frankly, would have suggested that I would do this. I was relatively, and still am, I'm a relatively introverted guy. A lot of people don't believe that. I'm not the guy who walks into a crowded room and sticks out his hand and says, "Hi, I'm Mark Friedman." That's not my thing. I wasn't a great public speaker when I started. Not that I'm great now, but I'm able to hold a conversation with a guest, and I really enjoy that. I grew up. Both my parents were, my mom worked in an office. My dad, was in the apparel and fur space back then, but they were not marketers. They weren't consultants. But you are you become you become what you surround yourself with. And I've been really lucky. I've been the guy who's been able to pivot a number of times in my career, whether it be going and starting in finance. People ask me all the time, geez, how did you make that pivot from finance into marketing? I got lucky. Somebody saw me, they offered me a job. I had no experience, and I was able to make that work. And then while I was in the catalog business, and so many of my friends didn't make the leap or couldn't make the leap to digital, I got lucky again. They hired me at Brooks Brothers. I've enjoyed everything that I've done. And I like to be busy. So what I do today is great because I'm busy all the time.
Well, you know what they say is that luck finds you working. So maybe that's part of it too. But I appreciate how humble you are, especially after achieving what you have. Thank you, Mark. This has been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate you being on.
Yeah,
And I hope to do it again sometime.
Greg, that's great. Great questions, Zan. I enjoyed being with you. Thank you.
Thank you.